Hey everyone, it's Carissa Wiley here for Concord and Ninth. Thanks for joining me today. Today I have the pleasure of introducing you to the All-in-One Turnabout Jig. This fabulous new tool from Concord and Ninth is going to make all of your turnabout stamping even easier because it has all the things you need to get a perfect alignment and a perfect stamped image. And I'm going to walk you through this today. So here's a look at the All-in-One Turnabout Jig in its packaging, and you can see that on the packaging it's colored blue, and that's just to help you see it on the packaging. But when you remove it from the packaging, you'll find that it is a clear jig with white printing on it. There are instructions inside the packaging that will walk you through this entire process. So here is what the All-in-One Turnabout Jig looks like when you take it out of the packaging. Now, there is a protective covering on that, and you don't want to throw that away. You want to keep that in your stash. That is going to protect the adhesive that is built into this brand new tool, making it even easier to set up your turnabout stamping. Now, there are numbers in the corners, and there are also A2 size guides for aligning your cardstock on the jig. So you can see the numbers here in each corner, 1, 2, 3, and 4, just like the original turnabout jig. And there is a 1/4-inch grid across the entire surface of this jig, so you can align different size cardstocks as well. Now I'm going to demonstrate this with the Flower Garden Turnabout Stamp today. And in all of your Turnabout Stamp packaging, you're going to find not only the stamp itself, but this alignment guide. And that's really important when you're doing turnabout stamping. Now the original packaging will not have this X on it. And that's how you can tell the difference between the alignment guide and the stamp packaging if you ever get that confused. So I'm going to start by removing my turnabout stamp from the backer. And rather than pull and stretch my stamp, I prefer to just kind of hold on to the stamp and pull with the most force on the backer sheet. And that way I'm not stretching out the photopolymer stamp because these are often very large stamps. Now I have the backer of the stamp packaging behind my alignment guide so that you can really see how I'm doing this here. And I am just taking my turnabout stamp with the images facing down. So the back side of the stamp is facing up towards the camera. And I've positioned my stamp onto the alignment guide using the pattern as my guide. So the pattern of the stamp lines up with the pattern of the alignment guide. Now it's time to bring in my All-in-One Turnabout Jig and place it into my MISTI stamping tool, making sure that it's lined up in whichever corner you prefer. Then I'm going to bring in my alignment guide with the stamp positioned on it, and I am going to align the X on the alignment guide with the X on the All-in-One Turnabout Jig. So you can see they kind of disappear into each other when they're all lined up. Now that I have that positioned on top of the All-in-One Turnabout Jig, I'm going to close the door of my MISTI to pick up my stamp, and I will have it in the perfect position on my MISTI stamping tool. Now I'm just going to remove this alignment guide, and I'm going to keep that in my stash because when I use this in the future, I'll need it. Now my stamp is positioned, and now I can prepare my All-in-One Turnabout Jig. So at this point, I have left the protective coating on the All-in-One Turnabout Jig so that it won't pull the printing off of my alignment guide. But now that I'm no longer using the alignment guide, I'm going to go ahead and remove the protective film, place it off to the side so that I can put it on my All-in-One Turnabout Jig for storage. And I'm going to bring in this piece of A2 white cardstock and align it with the A2 size rectangle that is already pre-printed on my All-in-One Turnabout Jig. And you can see that my cardstock is held securely in place on that jig so that as I'm doing my turnabout stamping, I don't have to worry about anything moving, and I don't have to add some removable adhesive on the back of my cardstock before I turn. I'm starting with my All-in-One Turnabout Jig nestled in that lower right-hand corner, and the number 1 is in the upper right-hand corner of my turnabout jig. I'm going to ink up my stamp and stamp it in my first color of ink, which is sorbet. And then I am going to turn my All-in-One Turnabout Jig so that the number 2 is in the upper right-hand corner, making sure that this jig is nestled into that lower right-hand corner each time. For the second inking, I went ahead and cleaned my stamp and inked it up in the Stardust ink. Stamped it onto my cardstock, and now I am going to turn my All-in-One Turnabout Jig again, and now I have the number 3 in the upper right-hand corner. I've cleaned my stamp. I'm inking up again, this time in Aqua Sky, and stamping onto my cardstock. Now this fourth and final turn will complete my pattern. So I'm taking the number 3 and rotating this around to where the number 4 is in that upper right-hand corner. And I'll finish off this color palette with the color Oceanside. Now you will notice that there is ink around the edge of my cardstock and it has gotten on my Turnabout jig. That is not a problem at all. I'm going to show you how to clean that up in just a bit. But let's talk about removing your cardstock from the All-in-One Turnabout jig. If I were to grab this corner and peel the cardstock off, it's going to cause my cardstock to curl and bend. So instead, I recommend rolling the All-in-One Turnabout jig away from the cardstock to keep your panel as flat as possible. I'll show you what I mean here. If I grab that corner and just peel it off, look how warped my cardstock is. But by rolling the jig away from the cardstock, it will keep my panel nice and flat. Now there are two ways to clean this Turnabout jig. You can either wipe it down with a low lint cloth like a baby wipe, or you can do what I like to do, and that's just run it underneath some warm water. And once it dries, the tack will return and you'll be ready to use your All-in-One Turnabout jig again. Now here is a look at that Flower Garden Turnabout stamp, stamped in a few different color combinations. That first one was our original combination. The second color combination includes Peacock, Stardust, Evergreen, and Ballet Slipper. Then I have Ballet Slipper, Grapefruit, Parsley, and Evergreen. And finally, this panel stamped on wheat cardstock in Ballet Slipper, Stardust, Peacock, and white pigment ink. It is such a beautiful combination. Now I used that second color combination to create this card along with the coordinating Flower Garden die set, which has this great "You Are Simply Amazing" sentiment that I die cut from some wheat and white cardstock and placed that on the front of my card. Now we just used a very large Turnabout stamp, but I wanted to show you that this All-in-One Turnabout jig is great for your smaller Turnabout stamp sets as well. So I've grabbed my Confetti Turnabout stamp and I'm going to go ahead and show you this process again. I'm starting with my alignment guide on my surface. The words are going the correct direction, so make sure that you can read your alignment guide as you're positioning your stamp. Otherwise, it just won't work. And then you can take your stamp and align the pattern of the stamp with the printed pattern on your alignment guide. Now I'm going to bring in my All-in-One Turnabout jig that's positioned in my MISTI, and I'm going to align the X on my alignment guide with the X on the All-in-One Turnabout jig and go ahead and close the door of my MISTI. Now remember, I'm leaving the protective film on the All-in-One Turnabout jig during this step so that it doesn't pull the printing off my alignment guide. Then I can remove the alignment guide from the stamp, remove the protective film from the All-in-One Turnabout jig, and start my stamping. So I'm going to start with Ballet Slipper ink because it's one of my favorites from Concord and 9th. I have my Turnabout jig with the number 1 in the upper right-hand corner to start. And once I've done my first stamping, I'm going to go ahead and turn it so that the number 2 is in the upper right-hand corner. I've cleaned my stamp. And now I'm inking it up in Stardust ink and stamping it onto my cardstock again. Now, because I have my A2 cardstock aligned with the A2 size rectangle on my grid, I know that this pattern is going to end up dead center on my cardstock panel. So that works out really great. So after my second stamping, I rotated my All-in-One Turnabout jig again so that the number 3 is in the upper right-hand corner. I inked up my stamp in Peacock ink and now I'm stamping it onto my cardstock panel. And then I can do my final turn, my fourth and final turn here. My number 4 will be in the upper right-hand corner of my Turnabout jig. I'm going to clean my stamp and then ink it up in Sea Glass ink and stamp it once again. Now let's look at how to take this panel off of the Turnabout jig one more time. I am going to just kind of roll the Turnabout jig off of the cardstock panel so that I'm not bending the panel. Instead, I'm bending the Turnabout jig, and that keeps my cardstock panel nice and flat. Now, once this is all cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and replace the protective film over the All-in-One Turnabout Jig so that it stays sticky and clean for my next use, and then I can put that away and store it. So here's a look at that Confetti Turnabout stamp, stamped in a few different color combinations. This one here uses sea glass, peacock, midnight, and stardust. And then we'll go into kind of a pink monochrome here with a little ballet slipper, honeysuckle, grapefruit, and stardust. And this one's just a party and a card. I have poppy, peacock, parsley, and sprout. Now here's a look at a card that I created using the coordinating die set for this Confetti Turnabout stamp. And in this case, the die set adds extra imagery instead of additional sentiments. Now there are sentiments included in the Confetti Turnabout stamp, but keep in mind you can always dig in your stash and add sentiments from other stamp sets as well. So there you have it, a in-depth look at the brand new all-in-one Turnabout Jig from Concord and 9th. I think you're gonna love having this in your stash. Keep in mind that these jigs come in a single pack as well as a 3-pack, so you can stamp multiple backgrounds without having to clean your jig between each one. Thanks for joining me today. If you need more information, be sure to visit concordand9th.com. And until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day.